Hello, everybody. In the first two lectures, we covered some fundamental positions, king and pawn against king, connected passers, doubled pawns, and so on, and some basic fundamental positions. In this lecture, we'll be doing something slightly different. We'll be focusing on some basic tools you can use to help understand these pawn endgames better. And from there, with the tools you need in the basic positions to start off of, you can start to explore more complicated endgames. Okay, so the first tool I'm going to look at is something called corresponding squares. You might remember that I've mentioned these once or twice. And in this one, I'm going to explain exactly what they are and how you can use them in your own games. So another term you might remember is key squares. And these are basically the squares you really want your king to get to, the ones that will make it win or save the game. So for example, one that we've covered, these two pawns. White wins if his king can take this pawn because this pawn's more than halfway up. And so if the black king is, say, over here, then these would be the key squares, because from there, white can get to the pawn. So what corresponding squares are is basically if one's king is on a square, on a certain square, then the corresponding square is the other square the king wants to be on. So for example, if here white's king is on f5, black's king wants to stop the white king from getting any farther up. So the corresponding square would be f7. And to g5, it would be g7, and so on. And this continues all over the board. And this frequently applies to almost any pawn endgame, even the king and pawn against king. If you remember that these are the three key squares, for example, then e3 and e5 correspond, d3 and d5, and so on. And just to provide an example of how important these can be, there's one position that's fairly well known. It's a very strong example of corresponding squares. Okay. So basically, this position. So the idea is white wants to invade either through here or through here. And the black king naturally wants to stop him. And so at first this might seem like a completely baffling position, and it would be at first, probably is now, but the corresponding squares help make it a lot easier. So basically what you do is, for example, if the white king is on h4, then black wants his king on g6 to stop the king from coming any further. And the white king is on c4, then the black king wants to be on b6. And one thing that you have to note is that a6 does not correspond because you can count, it'll take white 5 moves to get to h4, and black in 5 moves can only get to f6. So white can get to h5 and he wins the game. So basically by doing this, you realize that black's king always has to be no more than one file to the left of white's, and using that information, you can get all sorts of corresponding squares. And this chain just continues. And if you keep doing this, because this is a very complicated position, I won't explain every square, but if you keep doing this, you can understand some positions that would seem impossible at first. That's the basic idea of corresponding squares. If my king is here, where's his going to be? If his is there, where's mine going to be? And so on. And, okay, so that's a basic tool. And now some other tools I want to explain to you. Now, unlike in the basic positions I showed you where it's here wins, here draws, these are just basic principles. For example, the first one is the active king position. This is a very, 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 very important thing to have. For example, let's say we have 3 pawns like this. Show an extreme example. Let's contrast 2 different sets of kings. Let's say white's on c1, black's on c3. Black has the active king, and white's pretty much on a last stand here because his pawns are gone. And basically to show how much of a difference this can make, let's say the kings are instead on black side of the board. Now the black pawns are toast. So this shows the importance of an active king. And frequently, this can compensate or in fact win despite pawn disadvantages, and so on. To show another example of this, let's say we've got this position. So when white moves, black's king enters, and it becomes active. And since white's king is on the defensive, white here is in great trouble, and in fact he's dead lost, because first this pawn goes, then this one, and then these two are in trouble too. And again, to understand just how important this is, just consider what the difference would be if the kings were, say, here and here. So in general, in endings, it's important to be active with your pieces. In fact, in all stages of the game, that's a very important thing. But when you've only got one piece on the entire board, whether that's active or inactive can pretty much change the result of the game, as you saw in the last two positions. So that's one thing you definitely want to remember. So another thing is doubled pawns. I want to explain this in a bit more detail. So we covered how, although it's more difficult, you can still win with two doubled passed pawns. But to show what a difference it can make, let's say, for example, we've got the following pawn positions. Got two kings. So at first this seems, to someone who wouldn't understand pawning games, this seems very similar. You've got two pawns here against one. You've got two pawns here against one. It's almost a symmetrical position. There's some very slight differences. But in fact, here white is dead lost, for the simple reason that his pawn is on b3 instead of a2. And the reason that this makes him lose is because no matter how far he pushes his pawns, no matter what he tries to do with them, he simply cannot create a passed pawn. It's impossible. But the difference is, when you've got this 2-on-1 on the black 2 against the white pawn, black can play h5, then g5, and then h4, and he's got his passed pawn. And as you might remember, the basic tool black uses makes this passed pawn, white goes to stop it, then black takes white's pawns, and his third pawn promotes. Okay. So even in more complex examples, these basic rules hold. It may not be quite as clear at first that they do this, but in general, it's just useful to remember these tools, even though they don't help you definitely evaluate the position. Say, oh, this is one because he has passed pawn, he has double pawns. You can still basically think, oh, I'm better here, as we saw in that last example. Okay, and so another useful rule to remember, when you've got, say, this 2-on-1, and this also, just to show the universality of this, when you have a pawn majority like this and your aim is to make a passed pawn, you always first advance the pawn that does not have a pawn opposing it. So if, say, on this 3 versus 2, we want to make a passed pawn, so the pawn we choose to advance is the c pawn first. Just to show what can go wrong, if we play b4 first, black plays b5, and all of a sudden we find we can't advance either one of these pawns without giving black a passed pawn. And it's a very tragic mistake, because if you just play c4 first, then b4 and a4, then c5, keep up the pattern, and so on, you will get your passed pawn. Same thing for the other side of the board. You want to play h5 first. It's black's move. And then g5 and h4, as I said, because should you happen to play g5 first, white will play g4, and once again you'll find that you're in a lot of trouble because you don't have a passed pawn anymore, at least not without giving white one. So actually, to show a position from a real game, real players, this was a real mistake, just to show what can happen if you don't understand this. Here, for example, black's up a pawn, and he's simply got a 1 game. All he has to do is, say, play f6, g6, f5, or the same thing with the h-pawn. He's got two passed pawns. You remember from the previous lecture, so let's just show what could happen. How the two passed pawns are safe from the king with this structure right here. That was covered in an earlier lecture. You might want to watch that if you don't understand why this is invulnerable. So basically, the point is, all black has to do is make his two passed pawns with this 3-on-1 majority, and he's got a dead one game. But unfortunately, in the game, black erred tragically, played g6, probably intending to play h5 next. Same idea, except maybe it saves a move, or appears to, or f5 next. But white played g5. And all of a sudden, black finds that he's in an enormous amount of trouble because even though he has 3 pawns to 1, because he ignored this principle, he can't make a passed pawn. Because either way, if he plays f5, white takes en passant. Same thing with h5. And now, all of a sudden, black's pawns are completely stuck. Not only that, but since white's got one extra pawn here, that's enough to make a passed pawn. And so, in fact, black's dead lost, and that's what happened. White made a passed pawn. And basically, white won, just to show. And now you might remember this position also. It's a good one to know. Black's in zugzwang, so he lost all 3 of his pawns in the game. And all because he didn't understand this principle that I'm showing you now. Advance the pawns that don't have pawns in front of them. You'll do a lot better in your games, unlike the guy you just saw. Okay. So another idea, basically the theme of mobile pawns. You always want your pawns to be able to move. In general, I mean, passed pawns are the best example of this because they can advance freely. There's nothing opposing them, except the enemy king, whose job it is for them to distract. Now, the extreme opposite of this, as you just saw, is when you have all these pawns, but they're completely immobilized, like this. And so you can see from this that basically, in general, it's better if your pawns are able to advance, if they're able to create passed pawns especially, which are the most mobile of pawns. So those are the basic things, basic desirable things in pawn endgames. Obviously, I mean, one that's more straightforward is extra material. Generally, it never hurts to be up in pawns. So then there's that, and then there's the positional considerations I've been showing you. Active king, when it's the only piece you have on the board, you pretty much have to be doing something with it. There's some very well-known pawn endgames. A couple I'll be showing you in later lectures, including one by Rubinstein, who was renowned for this endgame, that basically show just how important it is to have an active king in these endgames. So a position that might seem equal or even better for one side can be completely reversed when the king is reduced to some of the positions I showed you. Okay. And then there's second idea, the mobile pawns, the passed pawns. Those are always beneficial too. Of course, again, passed pawns are the best, and the ones that are supported, either by being protected or by being connected to other pawns, are also ideal. And again, to show how these themes apply to endgames in general, here's another real game example done by one of the greatest players ever, actually known Pillsbury, who actually was the underdog at this tournament, but managed to come back to win it with this win in this game. And so he was actually white in this pawn endgame. I mean, someone who's new to pawn endgames, who hasn't seen these themes, would have no idea how to make head or tail of this position. At first, I mean, the basic thing it seems like is white's in trouble because black's going to take this pawn, then he's going to be up a pawn, and pretty much the game's over because black's got the 2-on-1 for a passed pawn here, and that's that. But if you remember the ideas I've been talking to you about, and you start thinking, you realize white has a bunch of other ideas. And in fact, there's one in particular that Pillsbury found, I'm going to show you in a moment, That in fact means white is winning here. Obviously, white has to act fast. I mean, at first it does seem hopeless because black only needs 2 moves to secure everything. But if you remember, passed pawns want support. In particular, if you have 2 pawns supporting each other, 2 connected passers, like let's say b2 and c3, a5 and b6, if you have 2 pawns supporting each other like that, they're completely invulnerable. And so, first this seems unrelated because there's no obvious way to support this e6 pawn, but in fact, there is. If we can get this pawn out of the way, which we do by this pawn sack, e4. This is what Pillsbury played. And so, if black decides to go after this pawn anyway, white takes d5. These pawns are invulnerable as we saw before, and black's position is hopeless. Okay. So what actually happened in the game, black played the obvious move, he took the pawn. So white did d5 check. And again, the pawns are invulnerable, and with the d4 pawn is actually irrelevant. And so the black king is stuck guarding these pawns. Even though black still is the pawn ahead because of the sack on e4, his king is stuck. Meanwhile, white's king has absolute freedom. And so white's actually the one winning. In the game, white did king e3, took this pawn, went over to the queen side to deal with these pawns, and black had to resign in about 15 more moves. There are some complicated lines, but they're irrelevant to this. So these are just some basic examples. One last real game example. This one's about doubled pawns. This one basically shows a real world example of just how fatal or how weak these pawns can be. So another position, equal material. Both kings are fairly active. I mean, obviously they're not on g6 or a3, tying the other king down, but kings are in decent positions in the middle of the board. There's even pawns. Both sides have a majority on one side. But in fact, again, white is completely lost. And the reason for this is none other than the simple fact these pawns are doubled. And the reason this means white is lost is because there is no possible way for him to make these pawns against these into a passed pawn, at least not without a mistake by black. And however, black doesn't have a doubled pawn on this side, so he can make a passed pawn, and therefore he's actually, again, like I said, he's winning. Now, if you didn't understand the ideas of doubled pawns, of making a passed pawn with a majority, and so on that we've been covering, a beginner would have no idea how to even start with this position. We're not ready to understand it fully yet or go into any complicated details, but you can understand it even if you can't immediately tell white is lost, and that's not inherently obvious. A player who understands these themes can see that white's in trouble, that white's the one struggling because he can't make this passed pawn. So basically what I'm trying to show you is, even with these basic ideas, double passed pawns, king activity, passed pawns, and so on, you can start to get a grasp or an understanding of positions that would seem impossible except to very strong players. But just building off these basic themes and off a few concrete positions, the ones in the first 2 lectures, you can start to really understand these positions. And that's going to be the pursuit in the next few lectures. Okay, let's to wrap it up. Just remember those tools, keep them in mind. Probably get some practical experience with a few endings. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.